This is a potted history because I'm going to take a particular slant. It's a very simple slant, but I think it's important to take the simple slant, and I'll tell you why as we go along. My perspective is from the point of view of implementation. So I'm at the University of South Australia, and I'm charged with rolling out learning analytics within that institution. So that's, in my terms, that's my day job. And I was saying to Sandra last night, I find a lot of the time, say on a monthly basis, I think, oh my God, I'll go back to the drawing board again. We've conceptualised this really wrongly, and if we pursue this in the way that we were going to, we're going to take some wrong turns. I'm also interested in this for all Australian institutions because with Shane Dawson, also at the University of South Australia, we're leading an OLT commissioned project that's looking at learning analytics, how it is in organisations, in universities in Australia at the moment, but also what the plans are over the next 5 years. And we're calibrating that with international experts. We're about to do a Delphi process that's going to, with international experts, that follows up extensive interviews we've done around Australia with, I would say, most DVCs or whoever is nominated within that institution as the person who knows where learning analytics is going for that institution. At the end of that, we're hoping to have something like, by framework, we're hoping to have something like a maturity model, so that, or models, it might be plural, but so institutions can go, okay, well look, this is a very confusing field. There's a lot of choices on the platter here. We want to get to a certain point. How do we get there, given the sort of institution we are and the resources that we've got? In all of this, I'm particularly interested in the contrast between what people say they do and what they actually do, and how that's going to work its way through the system as learning analytics gets rolled out. And it's coming. I mean, there's no avoiding an increased use of data to understand what we're doing in learning and teaching. And I'd really like to avoid, at least for my institution, but hopefully for all of them, this sort of millenarianism that follows it. Whenever IT is in education, it's whatever it is, it's the answer to everything. It's going to resolve everything. We won't have to ask any hard questions anymore. I remember reading a study Donald Shern wrote up about the implementation of a program at MIT. Forgotten the name of it. Fantastic idea. It was to put a desktop computer on every academic's desktop. Obviously, none of us would sit here today and say that hasn't changed education. This was, the 80s sometime. It clearly has. But the way they thought it was going to change education was nothing like what's happened. So they expected people to start programming and creating their own kind of software, essentially, their own kind of learning management systems, and that didn't happen. So if we can avoid misdirection as much as possible, that would be great. If you want an academic history of learning analytics, unlike the potted one I'm about to give you, there's a reference at the bottom here, and obviously these slides will be available. This is the definition that often floats around about what learning analytics is, and I think it's important to take note of that because it has a couple of implications that aren't specified. Simon talked about one of these, this closing the loop phenomenon. So it's not just about finding data. It's not just educational research in a cold, calculated at a distance from practice effect. It's about, okay, let's get data that is taken from the learning context but can be applied back to it. And then we can do a whole lot of tertiary research on that. How did this work out? When we took this information, when we took this data, when we applied a particular theoretical lens, when we then intervened with students, did we change things, and if so, was it for the better? Krista tells me there is no big data in higher education, but this is the term that's often bandied about. So it's implied in this definition that the way we're looking at things can accommodate data on a scale that we haven't done previously. I think the first famous foray, I'm from the School of Business originally, and business analytics was all the buzz for a while. And it made a very convincing case that a number of industries had been transformed by their use of analytics. So if you think of flying on an airline, all the load planning that goes into that, I can remember getting on planes that were quite empty. That's rare now. I mean, maybe coming to Wagga Wagga it's not, I'm not sure, and the flights that I do, full, okay, all right, well that's load planning. It's worth billions, just a simple understanding of the underlying data and how to apply it. The same has been applied in insurance, gambling, a number of fields. And so businesses everywhere were throwing up data warehouses, and we'll talk a bit more about them a bit later in relation to education. It's been a bit of a disappointment in reality on the ground. So even though it has transformed industries, it doesn't mean that every business within an industry that got a data warehouse and had a plan to use analytics has done much with it. So I found this quote the other day from something that a guy called Cole Beer had written. The vast majority of big data and business analytics projects fail, not in a great big system won't work way. They fail because the users just don't use them. And that's exactly what I would like to avoid in learning analytics. I think the next big famous point I think a good idea, Simon had his nice elevator pitch, but another one is to say, people say, what do? You say, well, it depends on whether you want to talk to them or not, but assuming you do, you say, have you seen the film Moneyball or read the book Moneyball? And often people have. So I think this is an introduction to analytics for a lot of people. Now, you're thinking, okay, this is a bit lowbrow, isn't it? Can't you get more academic than this? But remember, I'm talking to university management a lot of the time, and it's not that it's lowbrow, but it's just that there's a huge amount of information that they have to filter. So understandably, what gets filtered through is very high profile. So at least at a metaphoric level, these kinds of things really have an impact. So if you don't know the story, and I imagine most of you do, but the Oakland Athletic baseball team could not compete with the other baseball teams. They didn't have the budget. So they had to find an alternative way to compete. This is largely a true story, obviously much more so in the book by Michael Lewis than in the film with Brad Pitt. But they constructed what was almost a complete sporting fairy tale by using what was called sabermetrics. Sabermetrics had been around since the 70s. It was the use of analytics in baseball, but it had been used only partially and was sometimes derided and was overlooked in favour of gut instinct. So a lot of baseball scouting, for example, when you're finding new talent, was based on gut instinct. So Oakland Athletic had to go all the way. They were forced into a corner, and they decided on a kind of revolutionary cultural change where they backed the data against their own instincts. And it ended up working out for them, and of course became a very famous story as it went along. But again, if you look at subsequent articles that have been written, interviews with baseball scouts and different teams, it hasn't been used subsequently exactly like that. Quite often scouts have an input in it. Expert opinion hasn't died within baseball, and I would say no team is about to drop it. So then, moving to higher education, what's the dominant metaphor that's come across there? Now, in a derogatory way perhaps, or pejorative way, course signals has been mentioned a couple of times today. I'm just going to show you their introductory video, so for those of you who don't know it, you get an idea of what it was all about. It had a very powerful, still has a very powerful and pervasive influence.
Course Signals is a tool that predicts how you'll do in a course and alerts you about potential problems. Let's say we're at week 3 in the semester. If you wanted to predict how well you would do at the end of a course, what would you want to know? You might want to use points in the course so far, or time on task. You might look at how you performed in the past. Course Signals looks at these 3 factors and gives you a prediction of how likely you are to succeed in the course. Your instructor may run signals throughout the course. It's up to them to decide how often they run it. When your instructor runs course signals, you'll see a stoplight when you log into Blackboard. It isn't updated in real time, so this stoplight will remain the same until your instructor runs course signals again. Well, unless you get the same color, then you won't notice any difference. If you see a green light, you're on track to do well on the course. If you see a red light, Course Signals predicts that you will need to make serious changes to do well on the course. If you see a yellow light, there is room for improvement. Now here's a really important bit. Course Signals is not just a way to tell you what your grade is in a course. Remember, there are other factors that make up the signal. While we're talking about the factors, for the first factor, points, your instructor sets a range for what grades they consider: low risk, medium risk, and high risk of not succeeding in the class. Different instructors will have different ideas of what grade goes with what risk. If your grade falls into the high risk category, you'll automatically receive a red signal. If your grade falls in the medium or low risk ranges, Course Signals looks at the other two factors, time on task and your characteristics and past academic performance. It adds those three factors together and comes up with a colour. And that's how your signal is created.
So before we evaluate it, we'll talk about evaluating it. Okay, this is why do we need signals? Okay, so the horror of a large Oxbridge tutorial. Class size might go up by 33%. This was an actual article to 4 students. There's a help page for academics whose class size increases from 3 to 4 students. If only my problems were like that. In tutorials which may have more than 2 or 3 students, the group dynamic will be different. So, and so on and so forth. All right, so there were some good things about signals. And it certainly was an early benchmark of closing the loop. You know, someone did some background research, they looked at what are the risk factors for students, they carefully calibrated that, they tested that in a novel population, they then developed an intervention, they applied that, they then evaluated that. And it was at least a rudimentary, I'm talking like it's dead, it is a rudimentary way of providing more timely feedback. It's not perfectly timely, but it's more timely. So as opposed to, and I'm sure many of you have been students in this, I know I have, students in this situation where you go, well, am I doing enough work in this class? I don't know. And then you get an assessment back and it's like 6 weeks before the whole thing's ended and you've discovered that you're way off track. So it's a way of keeping students a little bit closer to what's going on and using other students as a way of calibrating that to some extent. The not so good was the results aren't as strong as once thought. I won't dwell on that. That's mostly to do with their retention statistics. Some of their results have stood the test, but the question is whether you would have needed signals to get those same results. And something we've covered today but I think is important, the effects on different students are unknown. So we know from the motivation literature that students with low self-efficacy, and at UniSA we suspect, we're doing some research now, but we suspect a lot of our students are in that category. They're not sure that they can do very well in this particular course. If they get a very early signal that says you're not doing very well in this course, that then just sends them to a generic resource, I'm not sure that that's going to be motivating for them. So it may be construed differently at different institutions in a way that's more productive than that, but that's the usual way that Signals is rolled out. And I think, and most relevant to what I'm talking about today, it has almost set a framework around how people think of learning analytics. So when you mention learning analytics in an institution, many people go, okay, Davenport and Harris I've heard of, and Moneyball I've heard of, and if I'm talking about higher education, Signals I've heard of. I mean, it's arguable really whether it's learning analytics at all, because there's various categories of analytics, one of them being academic analytics. Is it more in that category of preventing student attrition and less about the actual learning process of students? I suspect it probably is. Right, so I mentioned before at the beginning that we were looking at developing a maturity model as part of our investigation of universities in Australia. How can they move forward? This is a quite well-known one. This was written for management within universities in the US context. It's basically an adaptation of Davenport and Harris's work on how businesses can mature in the way that they use analytics. The important thing to note is that as you develop a sort of level of sophistication, your analytics can produce more timely reports till you get to the point where you're actually ahead of the curve and you're saying to students before time, okay, things may not be working out very well for you. It's another take on that kind of concept of a maturity model. Right, so it's a sort of, I like this one a bit better because it gives you a bit more of an idea of where you're going, but even here, it's not really clear what I would do. If I was an institution, what would I do next? Well, I can tell that I've got reports. We know we've got someone working on sample dashboards, so I guess they're experimenting with data, but I'm still not quite sure what the next step is. So that's what our project is about, and at the moment we've sort of got a flailing maturity model. So what we've got really is, and this is generalising, but most universities in Australia fit this picture so far. we've got the notion of a data warehouse being developed, or it has been developed, so, or a system very similar to this, where all the data is being pulled. Now, by all the data, I mean the demographic data, so your student information system data, your performance data out of, you use Blackboard here, I believe, but out of Moodle, whatever your learning management system is, or if your performance data is kept somewhere else, then wherever that is kept. And also the data that relates to what students do in terms of their activity, usually measured in terms of how they relate to the learning management system. You might have other systems. We do Echo 360 for lectures, but all those pieces of software and all those repositories either have data or produce data, and so they're all getting pulled into one space where someone can go and dig in and start doing things with them. Now, what is it that they're doing? They're doing signals. This is the typical response we get, even if it isn't signals literally the program. It's like, well, we're developing a model whereby we can see students who are at risk, and we've got a team of people who phone up those students and say to them, hey, things aren't working out for you. Do you need a hand? Or how about this resource or that resource? So we say, that's great. So where do you think you're going next? Or where do you think you want to end up? And most of them get to some of the things that Simon and Krishna were alluding to or demonstrating, this notion of some kind of form of personalised learning. So, and you can see the revolutionary potential of this. Like at the moment at our university, I suspect all of them, it's like the tail wagging the dog. We've got people doing timetabling, and that determines what students do. It really works backwards from that. So, if we have a student who does really well for 80% of their course, but then they fail an exam and they fail a supplementary exam, they have to go right back to the start. Well, when is that course running? Oh, it's run at the end of the following year. So now they're now out of contact with all their cohorts. It might have practical consequences for their career and all sorts of things, but it doesn't seem a sensible way to do it, but we're constrained by the structure that we've inherited. So to produce something that's more personalised, that's more timely, that can do some of the things that Krishna and Simon were talking about before, so that you learn the next thing that's relevant for you, based on an analysis of past students perhaps, seems a good goal. But all these steps from every university we've talked to, barring one maybe or two, are complete blanks. So I don't think many people are clear about where they want to go, in a sort of vague way, but they're not very clear about how they're going to get there. I'm going to canvass one particular reason for that, and I think it's that we've got to start distinguishing between global and local learning analytics. So everything down the left here is much more on the global side of things. So if we're talking about retention and success, because what sort of risk are we predicting here? And often these things are conflated, but they're clearly not the same. And they're different goals for different people. The institution is very interested in retention. The institution is also interested in success, but who has to carry out the work that enables students to be successful? Now, at our institution, we have course coordinators. At yours, you would have course directors. So for a course coordinator at our institution, retention is not an issue for them. I mean, it would be great if the student comes back, but it's important to them, for their day job, for their metrics, that student has to do well. Whether the student comes back or not is something else. So you can probably see where I'm going here. If you have a system like Signals and it's calibrated around retention, it's not possibly doing them any kind of favour. The institutional thing lines up with retention. It also lines up with an IT versus teaching and learning perspective. So who is driving learning analytics in your institution? That's a question we ask every institution. It's rarely a teaching and learning centre. Now, sometimes it is, or sometimes it's a DVC who can see that this has to be driven by pedagogical concerns to start with. If it's driven by an IT first perspective, then we're likely to make some mistakes. Some of them will be ethical mistakes. And actually, I'm not going to talk about ethics all that much, although if there's time I can contribute a bit there. So this is really about the primacy of levels. Are we looking at an institutional level, a degree level, or a course level? Because they all have slightly different owners. There's certainly overlap, for sure. But someone's primary day job is not necessarily what someone else's is, depending on where they work in the system. And there are many large-scale analytics projects operating in the world now, and I can tell you categorically they cannot inform all of those things. It's like a search for, a quixotic search for a magical algorithm that will give you the student who is going to fail. And then you can bypass all the difficult stuff and just contact that student, and it won't work that way. Part of it is based on research. This is research we've done, but there's research that's not far away from this. Okay, we took 9 courses, 4 different divisions, and we looked at the relation. This is a standard sort of research approach. We looked at the relationship between the way the students use the tools in their learning management system and how the students went in terms of their course performance. But what we did do that people don't typically do is look at, okay, well, we've got the aggregated data and we can pick out tool use that suggests that if students use these tools, they will succeed. However, if you break it down course by course, you get quite different results. And in fact, the results are sometimes converse the recommendations. So you will get students who, if they were recommended to use particular tools based on the aggregated data, and they use those particular tools within their course, they would be doing the wrong thing. So for learning success, I think these and other studies that look at the differences between disciplines in terms of learning management system tool usage, the course is the important category level that we need to look at. And that implies to me that there's a very strong role for theory and pedagogy, and there's no analytics that's going to allow us to bypass that in general. Now, there'll be exceptions to that. Those of you who've used the Khan Academy on the web, which takes students through different sort of branches of mathematics. So I can see how that can be quite generalised. But in most cases where you're designing a course, your learning design will set the key variables for success in that course. So if you are using some kind of constructivist paradigm, and you want students to interact with each other, and you set up a discussion list, and you set up the reward system within the course so that students discuss, and you reinforce that in various ways, and a global algorithm suggests that the key variables in your course are something other than that, that global algorithm is likely to be wrong. Okay, so the lesson from that is that learning analytics can't be decoupled, I don't think, from the situated learning in the classroom. And course coordinators are masters of their domain. Now again, this varies by institution, but when I was a course coordinator, I mean, basically no one told me what to do. There was a textbook, and it was just hell getting the textbook through the bureaucratic process. I don't know if that's the case for you here, but once it's there, the last thing you want to do is change that textbook. So you're not going to do that in a hurry. So you've got 2 kind of things that are setting the railroad tracks, if you like. You've got the course coordinator, you've got the textbook. Now that's the organisational reality that many institutions face and that learning analytics will have to interface with. As course coordinator, I hired the tutors. I didn't go up and see somebody and ask them whether I could hire this person or that person. As course coordinator, I set the template for how we did the marking. As course coordinator, I decided what grades were given to what. I decided on the learning design. There was no one else involved in that, unless they were part of my team, of course. Yeah, so I'm not saying that this is necessarily a great thing, that the person who's convening the subject is king or queen, but often in many universities it is, even if they're doing it as part of a collaborative team. And so that brings up interesting questions about vendors. So I was in the camp of thinking that vendors were generally bad. It was sort of, I feel like now it was a fairly simplistic notion, but there is some truth to it, because it's almost imperative for vendors to produce a solution which is cost effective for them to implement. Once you start saying that we're going to do things course by course, it's much more difficult to create algorithms that are going to adapt to that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a much more expensive enterprise. The vendor relationships that I've seen doing this OLT research have suggested that vendors come along to universities and say, we have an algorithm, it will produce something that will predict student success. I don't think it will. I would doubt it very, very much. Or it does only under very special circumstances. There's a great danger in implementing global solutions at any rate. There's also something about the power of the textbook in that. So I've met with people in Pearson and McGraw-Hill, and they understand that they have a lot of leverage. So within our institution, there are things we don't want academics to do, but sometimes they do them anyway. So they'll use a piece of software that they purchase, and they'll want that integrated with our learning management system. Now, the people at the back end are like, oh, this is terrible, we should have a policy that stops them doing it, but that's not going to happen. While they're using that textbook that they want to keep using, and then the vendor comes along, and the vendor in this case being the publisher, and says, I've got this really nifty software that can build on the top of this textbook that you already like, and that it can do great things pedagogically. It can tap into students' metacognitive understanding. It can allow them to converse with you anonymously about the muddiest points that they have in the course, all sorts of things that you would struggle to do if you were to develop it from scratch. The obvious thing they're going to do is go, actually, yes, this makes sense to me. How much longer have I got? Because I wasn't quite sure how I... 5? So the difficulty with that is that then the vendors have the data. Now, I've spoken to 2 companies about this, and they have different perspectives. One has said, okay, the data is your data, although we're not sure exactly the conditions under which we'll release that data to you. So you're getting your students to interact with this software that goes with this textbook or whatever. That's producing data. We're recording. We will share it with you. The other, upon request, the other vendor, after repeated requests and negotiations, said, look, actually, we're going to hang on to the data. We don't know exactly what we're going to do with it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. He certainly didn't put it like this to me, but we don't know exactly what we're going to do with the data, but actually it's our data because we invested so much money in developing this software, and data isn't just data. And I think he's got a point here. When we've developed a piece of software that's very expensive that you couldn't have developed yourself, you just didn't have the resources. And then that data can give you an insight into the way students are reacting to your courses. So their muddiest point is here, here, and here. And their metacognitive understanding is very poor, and it could be related to this portion of the course. That's value-add data we're giving you there. So we're going to expect something back for that. Now, I was going to show you a quick example of, which I won't now if I've got 5 minutes, but of Learning Catalytics, which is a Pearson product. I'm not advertising Pearson, I'm certainly not advertising Learning Catalytics, but it was a pedagogically derived piece of software for interacting with students. It's very beneficial if you're wanting to flip a classroom, doing blended learning, that kind of thing. And I think there are other examples like that. McGraw-Hill has Learn Smart. They're actually good pieces of software. So I have this very mixed feeling about the role of vendors in all of this and how that's going to pan out in the long run. There's a conversation I had with an academic very early on in this process. We were showing them a dashboard that we were going to roll out, very much like a signals kind of dashboard. And she said, look, all this looks fantastic, but to be frank with you, I'm never going to use it. And she's a lecturer that I'd worked with. I know she's very student-centred. I know she's good. So that's important contextual information, because what she said next is, look, for me it's a hygiene factor. It's not a motivating factor. For me, the motivating factor is research, and the conversation that I have with my head of school, where he evaluates my performance, he has said to me concretely, don't focus on your teaching. You've done well enough in the teaching, that's fine. Your set scores are all good, etc. Let's just get more research papers out there. That's the important thing. Now, in many institutions in Australia, this is going to be an organisational reality that learning analytics comes up against. There's an interesting distinction along these lines that are made by Cole Beer and David Jones, that's right, about doing it to, doing it for, and doing it with. And I think they've written a paper for the forthcoming Askellite on this notion. And I think it's important. So the doing it to, if learning analytics is done to people, if we expect people to just show up and then we'll give them an algorithm and it will pick out the students that are at risk, but it's a black box to us. We don't know why they're picked out. Or if the students are exposed to the dashboard, they don't know why they're picked out. That's the doing it to them kind of approach. And I think, as both Simon and Krishna have mentioned, I think if we go down that road, then we cut ourselves off at the knees, because we need to get much better data from within the classroom, because I think the classroom, where the subject is taught, is going to be the most important portion of analytics if we're going to improve student learning and student outcomes. We need really clean data from that environment. So we need students and lecturers to feel like, I'm going to be honest with everything that's going on here. I'm happy to expose data about myself because I can see how it's beneficial. I think if we get into the doing it to them approach, then we run the risk of going against the grain of that. The doing it for model, places like the one I work for now, the Learning and Teaching Unit, and similar in other universities, are used to that approach, where we learn how to do something and then we go out there and assist the few academics who want to do it. But I think that's a very limited way. We need to find ways of doing it with academics. So we need to find ways that are motivating for academics to use these tools, so it's integrated within their own practices. And by doing so, then we can, there'll be different elements of these and they'll mix together at different times, but then we can do stuff for them. But there has to be a sense in which they can see that there's a payoff for them. One part of that could be just seeing how these things, the doing to, doing with and doing for, could be split up along the lines of different stages in the student's journey. You know, we're about to embark on a project where we're looking at what we call big data, where we're looking at students' demographic factors. So before they enrol, can we pick out the kind of students that struggle in the first 6 weeks? If so, we're going to get our marketing team, not our learning and teaching team, to call those students and just make sure they've got everything they need. And then we'll do further investigative work and work out what it is that those students are struggling with. So then we can start to make quite targeted calls to students and say, hey, you know, have you got a place to study? Have you thought about how you're going to get to university? Those kinds of basic questions. Then university starts, and then both the university and what we call a division are very interested in whether we retain students, and this is a key portion of time where students drop out. So what are the factors that we can look at that will also draw big data, but we'll also look at in situ analytics that are derived from pieces of software that are used in the classroom. So how can we start to support students to get over the initial humps and commit to the university and stay with the university? And then eventually faculty and performance are the key things. So in this case, subject, faculty, student, they're the really key things. And it'll be learning design, it'll be, I feel like my future is about to end, so very quickly. So I think the future will be these kinds of things. We'll get better clarity about which pieces of data fit where, so there won't be so many gaps between where we want to go and where we are now. I think the predictive modelling and grand algorithms train has done its dash. I think the research will be more context-driven, and we've heard brilliant examples of that today. And so there'll be more, consequently, more focus on what's happening in the classroom, and somehow we have to find some accommodation with vendors because they do have the money to invest in some of these tools that are really neat. Thank you.